and I would like to welcome you to the Trajexion Conference, which is hosted by Abundant Life Church. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you the guest speaker of today. He is pastor. He is General Superintendent of the United Pentecostal Church International. He's the founder of New Life Church of Austin, Texas. He's a husband, father, and author of 34 books. I would like to present to you the workmanship of our Lord Jesus Christ, Dr. David Bernard.
Thank you.
Amen.
Sister Rachel. All right. Now, this is called the church planting track, and I've got 4 sessions. I've got notes in here, and I'll probably cover some of them, most of them, but I plan for each session to be different. But I need to get going. I need to find out, is everybody hearing me okay? And looks like we're doing all right here. All right. This is the church planting track. So how many of you are senior pastors thinking of doing a daughter work, or you are doing Daughterworks? Okay. How many of you are thinking about starting a church? Okay, so we're somewhere in the middle. I'll try to address my remarks that they would be helpful in both categories. But to get started, what we'll do, and let's see what our time looks like. The original time is 10:20, so we might take an extra 5 minutes or so to get going here, and then there's a breakout session. And even though we have discussion sessions, if you have questions or comments, I will be happy to address those, you know, if you just kind of wave your hand at me, something that you're interested in. But I'm going to talk about planting daughter churches, and there's a handout here. There are 2 handouts. One is called Planting Daughter Churches. The other, Planting Daughterworks within cultural or minority groups. So I'm going to approach it from the point of view of a senior pastor, but also this would apply for someone who's wanting to start as the Daughterwork pastor, and that should cover most everybody in this room. My advice, there's always going to be a need to start a church from scratch, sending someone into a new area where there is no church. That's how my wife and I started in 1992 in Austin, Texas. There were some other churches in the area. However, we started on the north side of the metropolitan area, and really that was a wide open territory. So I think we're always going to be needing to do that. But once we have a solidly established church in an area, that takes an immense time, resources, money, labor, time to get a church established. It takes years to develop people to maturity and to leadership. And so it doesn't make sense to have to keep doing all of that from scratch time and time again. But once you get a strong church, it makes sense to use that church as a launching pad. Or you might use the analogy of a beachhead. Just like in World War II when the Allies invaded Normandy, they through hundreds of thousands of men and tanks and personnel to establish that one small area. But once they established that area, they could use that to launch their invasion of the rest of France. They didn't have to every week do another invasion and establish another beachhead. They basically did one major invasion and exploited that. And it would seem to make sense that we would think in those terms, that once you have a church in a metro area or a church in a region, that you leverage the assets and the resources of that church to multiply churches. We haven't done that effectively in many cases in the past, and I think that's because we had a pioneer mentality. And it does make sense when there are vast areas of the country with no church, and there are numerous cities with no church, then each person launches on his own. And it's an entrepreneurial mode. It's a pioneer mode. There's a lot of virgin territory. Every person stakes out his or her own city and builds a church. But I would argue that we're beyond that mode now. And it doesn't make sense to rely on that exclusively. We need to be more intentional and more strategic. We need to move from a pioneer approach to a team approach. So many times districts depend on growth. As God calls somebody to preach, they show up to the district board and say, I want this city. The district board interrogates them, and if there's someone already there, they say, no, you can't go there, choose another city. And they just depend on somebody's initiative in order to grow. But that's inefficient. I think what we need to say is, let's be intentional. Let's target areas where we know we need growth. Let's teach ministerial ethics so we're not so worried about having more than one church in an area. Let's decide in advance if it's a metro area that needs more churches. We already know. And this is what we did in South Texas. At that time, our general superintendent, Brother Haney, challenged us to double. And we had one church per 60,000 people. So we just did the math and said, well, that means we need one church for 30,000 people. And that means any city of 50, 60,000 that has one church, we already know we want a second church. Any city or county or area of 100,000, we know we need 3 churches. Any metro area of 1 million or something, we need as many churches as we can possibly get. Stop counting how many churches. And stop measuring how many miles. Let's look more at how many people. And then, of course, once we attain that goal, then you break it down. I was going through one of the old manuals from 1959, and they had a rule that if it's over 10,000 people, you can start a church. If it's under 10,000 people, you couldn't. So years ago, that had a church already in existence. So that was kind of the cutoff that was used years ago, 10,000 people per church. And so that's an easy statistic. I've used this before because let's say you only want to reach 1% of the population of your area. Well, and then let's say that your average size church is around 100. Well, that would end up being one church for 10,000 people. And I think the only areas that have attained close to that are the state of Louisiana and the province of New Brunswick. So every other place in the country is nowhere near that. It's obvious that every church, and even in those two areas, it's interesting. Louisiana is the most saturated area in number of churches, but when you look at the southern third of the state and you look at the largest metro area, New Orleans, it's grossly underrepresented. Same way with New Brunswick. When you look at the major cities, there are fewer cities than that ratio throughout the rest of the countryside. So that 1 to 10,000 or approximately whatever it is doesn't hold true for the metro areas. So that means that every place in North America, we need to be thinking about planting more churches. So, to me, it makes sense to start with the Daughterworks concept, more of a team approach. And I know I mentioned this last night, but while I was pastor there in Austin, we started 16 Daughterworks that survived. A couple of those we started jointly with other churches. So it wasn't just a solo model. We were trying to reach the region. And so I would challenge us, and talking to North American Missions, they estimate roughly in our own ranks over the last 10 years or so, 70% of autonomous church plants close within 5 years. 70% of Daughterworks stay open within 5 years. So our own experience shows that it's more efficient to have a model where you're planting churches. So what that means is, let's say you're a senior pastor. I would challenge you to establish your church and then look for opportunities to help establish other churches around you. If you are someone interested in starting a church, I would challenge you to think in terms of working with a senior pastor in some way. I believe the Wisconsin district actually makes it a requirement that you have some sort of relationship with a senior pastor. And if you have a burden for a new area, you are assigned, or you try to find a senior pastor who will sponsor you or oversee you or be I don't know if they require formal daughter work or at least some kind of senior pastor relationship because of the value of what we're talking about. So how does this look like? What does this look like? Well, when I felt I was called to start a church in Austin, Texas, I did not think I could reach every single person in Austin. So my initial desire was to establish a strong church. I focused on that. And I didn't really have the concept of Daughterworks necessarily in mind. Although being raised on the mission field in Korea, I saw how that operated. So that was in the back of my mind. But I didn't go to Austin saying I'm going to start 16 churches. I just said I'm going to start a church. And the first daughter work was really based on need. We started winning some Spanish-speaking people. Some even received the Holy Ghost, but they couldn't really understand our services. So we attempted to start a Spanish service. And the first effort failed, the second effort failed, and finally the third one took hold. And that became our first daughter work. And then we started seeing people who were called to preach, or people who were soul winners who lived in neighboring towns or suburbs. And maybe they would come to church, but it became a little challenging to try to get the friends and neighbors they were working on to come. And so we just started doing Bible studies there. And then later on, as people felt the call to preach or to pastor, I told them, well, start with a Bible study in your neighborhood. Or let's look strategically in our area where we have holes, and I want you to see if you can find a location there to start a little Bible study. And if you win some souls, let's just start a little home friendship group or some kind of service. And so eventually, those started becoming Daughterworks. That was before the UPCI had an official preaching point policy here in the U.S., although we've had it overseas. And so the logical progression, it didn't necessarily happen in every case, but what could start with a Bible study could grow into a home friendship group. And how would that happen? You teach the initial Bible study, maybe win a few souls, but the people want to keep doing Bible study. They say, why do we have to stop? We need this. So that becomes a home group, a friendship group, cell group, whatever you use, whatever model. Well, then some of those people get converted, and maybe it's because of the drive, maybe it's because of language or ethnicity, maybe it's just because of the cohesion of the group, that while they come to the mother church, they still feel an identity locally, and they say, why can't we have a service? And some would come just to the Bible study or the fellowship, and as I said, it might extend week after week, month after month, and finally somebody says, well, this is my church. Why can't we just have a regular service on Sunday? And so the need is generated by the people themselves. And so then you start a weekly service. That could be called a preaching point. At that point, the preaching point is not, you're not saying it's going to become a church. You're just having regular services. But in the back of your mind, you're just exploring the territory. At such a time you feel like this has the potential to become a church, then you establish a daughter work. And the interesting thing is, the person who's in charge may or may not be the long-term pastor. I had some, they felt a call to pastor. We started the route I just mentioned. Over several years, they won people. They grew, their own ministry grew, and eventually they became a daughter work. They became the pastor of the daughter work, and eventually it became a self-governing church. Others were soul winners who got 20, 25, 30 people together. We rented a little facility. We were able to pay for it through the people that were giving. But then after a couple of years, the daughter work pastor would tell me, you know, I've won these souls through Bible studies, but now they're having marital problems, they're having this, they're having that. I'm not qualified to counsel them. That's not what I signed up for. You need to recruit somebody who has experience and a burden. I'm just winning these souls. I'm not ready to be their pastor. Well, then it's a lot easier to go on the outside. If you have 20 people in a rented building and the people are paying their rent, it's a lot easier to recruit a minister to come to that area and take over that existing work, instead of simply say, hey, there's a place to start somewhere. And so notice, what starts as the regular outreach of the church could result in a new church plant. I argue that every church should be doing outreach. Every church should be doing Bible studies or home friendship groups or something, some kind of organized soul winning. And my appeal would be to senior pastors, just do your outreach, but in the back of your mind, look for opportunities that something would develop that's more than an outreach. Especially look for when you get a contact, whether it be a convert or maybe one of your converts or one of your members has a connection in a neighboring town, a suburb, an unreached area of the city, another ethnicity, another language group. And of course, the language is obvious, but even ethnicity, you win someone who's maybe an immigrant or from a minority group, they may have extended family and friends, and sometimes they have a very strong ethnic solidarity. And so the point is not that we want to segregate, but if you win one person within that group, they may have very close ties to others that you can exploit, so to speak, and have a whole group. And so whether you integrate them into the mother church or whether you use that as a basis for launching in another area, whatever works. But the point is, you look for those opportunities. You're proactive. You're thinking in terms now of church planting. Now, if you simply win one or two people in the Bible study, the most logical thing might be simply to integrate them into the mother church, and the church grows. But if you
be somewhere miles down the river. It's going to carry you somewhere. So when you apply that to the church, what you end up with is that in a lake model, it's all about seeing how many people can we get into the lake. Success is how many people do we get into the lake. So a river model is the success is determined by, do we carry the person anywhere? Do they grow? Do they mature in the walk with God? Do they become a minister, in the church, to get involved in their ministry? Do we help them do that? It's failure when someone gets out of the lake. They move away, job transfer, something happens, and they have to move on, and it's considered a loss. In a river, you celebrate it because you're looking at the fact that this person, while they were in the river, they grew, they progressed, and so you celebrate that. You apply that to an event. Say you're doing a Christmas drama. A lake model would say the success of the Christmas drama is dependent upon how many people were at the Christmas drama. You had a large crowd, wow, great success. River model says, you know what, we're going to do everything we can to have a lot of people here. We want to expose them to the church. We want to connect with them. But what's most important is the fact that we have this drama team that's been working together for 3 months, and somewhere in 3 months of working together, they're clashing, they're having these little spats, and they're having to work through this, and somewhere in this journey, they actually become a closer-knit team. They learn to forgive one another. They learn to appreciate one another, and so it's a success. A lake model would say that a prayer meeting, the success is how many people showed up for prayer. A river model would say the success is determined by what happened to the people who did show up for prayer. Did they actually pray? The list just goes on and on. The difference between a lake model versus a river model. We see this in our calendar, our events. What purpose are we doing whatever it is that we're doing? Do we know what the purpose is? Do we have a purpose in mind, or are we just running from event to event, filling up a calendar, trying to be a larger church than what we are because we see them having all kinds of events and we just think we've got to have all kinds of events? So we end up many times looking like an octopus on roller skates. We have all kinds of movement, but we are not really going anywhere, and we don't even really know where we are going. Here just a few weeks ago, met with a pastor of a church, and their average attendance is somewhere between 300 and 400, around 350. And as we began talking and spent some time together, he finally looked at me and he said, I got to confess, he said, we are busy, we are doing all kinds of things, but I'm really not sure what it is that I'm really supposed to be focusing on. And we know, we'll say, reach the lost, we'll say those things, but the day-to-day activities, just so many things going on, and what is it that I'm supposed to be doing? So the question is one of purpose. What is it that we're supposed to be focusing on? And Ephesians, as Brother Woodward mentioned earlier, he gave the apostles, prophets, pastors, evangelists, teachers for the perfecting or the equipping. This word, to equip, it actually means to mend, to repair, to make whole, or to perfect. It is a mending of the nets. The verb form is used in Matthew 4 in verse 21. Jesus is walking on the Sea of Galilee. He sees Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They're at their boat. They are mending their nets. That word is the verb form of the same word that we read in Ephesians 4 and where it says perfect or equip. They were mending their nets. They were equipping their nets. So you could say it like this: they were mending, fixing their nets, making them strong, preparing them for service, preparing them, getting them ready for action to do something. And so when we talk about equipping people, we're talking about helping people change and grow and discover their gifts and get involved in utilizing those gifts, empowering them. So here's a few questions for you. First of all, what are you doing to equip people to do the work of ministry? if you're a Sunday school teacher, you're involved in any area of ministry, what are you doing to prepare people around you even to help them grow? The fivefold ministry, what are we doing to equip people? And number two, are you empowering people to do the work of ministry? Most people say the word empower and they're like, oh yeah, I did this. No, what you actually did is you delegated a task. There's a difference between empowering somebody and delegating something to someone. And certainly delegation is important, but even more so is empowering. Are you just delegating tasks to people, or are you empowering them? Are you helping them and to fulfill their ministry? So we're called to equip people. And we need to ask ourselves questions along these lines. What are we doing to help others change? What are we doing to help others discover their ministry? What are we doing to help others grow in their calling or ministry? What are we doing to empower?
If you quickly get a nucleus, that's an indication there is a need. If you want to think of it in marketing terms, 10 people are showing up, 15 people are showing up, 20 people are showing up. That indicates there is a blank spot that you're filling. People are coming to that neighborhood meeting because they need something there. So instead of just quickly saying, let's assimilate that in another church, maybe that's still the best strategy. But that may be an indication that you could grow at that location if you would focus on that. And then I would flip to the aspiring pastor, think in those terms as well. Think in terms of working with a senior pastor to exploit an opportunity in that community. So in my notes, I say you feel a call to community. So I felt a call to Austin, Texas. My goal was to build a church, but once the church was solidly established, I began to think strategically. How are we going to reach Austin? Well, number one, I wanted to be friends with existing pastors. So I made a point to, first of all, practice ministerial ethics, but also to try to communicate with existing pastors, thinking, we're trying to do the same thing. We're not really in competition. Now, there is that competitive spirit, and when you're the only church in a town and a second church wants to form, that can be a little threatening. But here's what I found from a district superintendent's point of view. When you have 10 churches in that town and 11th one wants to come in, nobody cares. You know why? They've stopped worrying about dividing up the Pentecostal pie, and they realize each church has its own character, its own personality, its own contacts. The way we're going to grow is to win souls. So in a metro area, to be very candid, sometimes the reason why a pastor doesn't want another church coming in is they're depending on people moving from the small towns, Pentecostal people moving, and they know if another church starts, that cuts down my flow from the rural area potentially by 50%. But once you realize, wait a minute, that's not how I should depend on church growth, then it changes. Now, obviously, we don't want somebody's unethical, but my statement there would be just like the use of spiritual gifts. We've all seen them abused, and some people have reacted by pretty much squelching spiritual gifts in their church because of the danger of misuse. That's not the right solution. The right solution is teach proper use and
others. What are we doing to release others? According to Edgar Dell's research, I think this is in 1969 or so, did this research, found that people generally only remember 10% of what they read. They only remember 20% of what they hear, only 30% of what they see, 50% of what they see and hear, 70% of what they say and write, and 90% of what they do. So when a person reads and hears something, they are able to define it, to describe it, to list it, to explain it if they hear or they and read. If a person reaches the level of seeing and hearing, they are able to demonstrate and able to apply and practice it. And when a person reaches the place that they are saying, writing, doing, the person now is able to analyze, design, create, and evaluate it. And it's at that level that things become concrete. So the essence of all of this is this point, is that people learn by doing. If people are not involved in doing, they're not really learning. So to just stand and teach, you're going to remember maybe 20% of what I say. So if you hear something, you go like, man, that's really great, and you don't go and apply it, it's not going to stick. You're not going to become that. They talk about single loop, double loop learning, and single loop is I tell you to do something, and I'm your boss, and so you just go do what I said, that needs to be done. You're doing something, but you're not actually becoming that. It's not becoming concrete. Double loop learning is where that you're able to analyze it, you're able to ask questions, you're able to assimilate it, and now you actually become that person. I remember this some years ago. I preached for a guy, and I got to know what the church was like. About 6 months later, he resigned, and evangelist assumed pastor of the church, and he was 100 miles an hour, and I'm telling you, it was like, come on, folks, and man, they were on their feet and clapping, and woohoo, and I thought, man, this church has changed. A year and a half later, the evangelist is fed up because the people are not getting with it enough, and he resigns, goes back to evangelizing, and a pastor comes in, and I visited just a few months after that, and guess what the church was like? It reverted back to what it was like before the evangelist ever became the pastor. So they were just doing it to accommodate, the speaker and the pastor at the time. So people, they actually learn by doing. 2013, I decided to do my own kind of research project. I wanted to see what things were like. So I visited the fastest growing church in America. I visited the 18th fastest growing church in America. About a year later, I went and visited the second largest church in America. And I went multiple times. I went to different services. I wanted to see what they were doing, how they were doing things. And I know that we can say, well, they don't have the full truth, they don't have this, they don't have that, and that's why they're growing. But there were a few things that really stood out to me that I thought was so unique in comparison to a lot of places I go. One, none of those churches were intent on trying to get my information. It's amazing at the churches we go to that you'll find in circles, apostolic churches, or, man, we need the visitor's information. We get the visitor's information, we do nothing with it other than maybe send a letter, and then it's all over with. These churches were not concerned with getting the information of the guest. What was astonishing to me was that from the very beginning when I walked in the door, I knew that if I wanted to take a next step in this church, I knew what that next step was. So clear. It was in the billboards. It was everywhere you went, you could see what the next step was, and they would talk about it in their services. They would say, hey, if you want to take a next step, stop by our next, in one particular church, stop by our next step kiosk. You see them lined up here in the auditorium. They were out in the hallway. Well, I'd already seen this next step everywhere. And another church I visited was 25,000, fastest growing church at the time in America. And they didn't call it next step, but you could see as you walked in, you knew what the next step was. The second thing that every one of these churches did was that they tried to involve people in ministry. I mean, it was very apparent. We want you involved in ministry. We're doing this, and they may be working on a house downtown or maybe feeding the homeless. They were doing something that if I wanted to, on that Sunday, I could have walked up to the next step and said, I want to be involved, and I could have been involved immediately. Whereas in most of our churches, to involve somebody in the ministry, in type of ministry and involvement and serving, you got to go through this, you got to go through that, you got to go through this, you got to go through that, and after you've been here a year and you've done all these things, then we might involve you in the ministry. So I began to realize, and I went to one of the churches and attended some of their leadership meetings just to find out a little bit more in depth. And I found out that their philosophy or mindset is that if we can get people involved, we can begin discipling these people. We will teach them. We will train them. They will make connections with other people. They will join in and become a part of our family, and then we can disciple them. That particular church actually baptizes. This was a church of 18,000 people. Now, at the time they had 12,000. They were the 18th fastest growing church in America. They actually baptize in Jesus' name, and they believe in the infilling of the Holy Ghost. And I met the pastor, and he's coming more and more this direction. He's got connections with quite a few ex-UPC people, and is embracing more and more. And it was just amazing to see a mindset that was about equipping people, and how can we equip people, and what are we doing to equip people. So I think some of the very basics of this equipping people is that, do you have a gift discovery class? Are you helping people discover their gifts? Are you trying to take people and you have a set parameter? Well, we have to have this, and that, and now I just got to find a warm body to fit this open area of ministry because someone has resigned and now we got to plug this hole. Or are you looking at that person and saying, what has God called them to do? What is their gifting? What is their calling? And how can I help that person mature and become what God wants them to be? I'll go a step further. We make most of the ministry about what goes on within the four walls of the church building. And yet a devout Christian and really involved will typically spend, in our circles, maybe 6 to 8 hours a week, and yet they're going to go spend 40 to 50 hours a week on their job. And what are we doing to validate that person on their job and help them understand that that is their mission field? And we want to come alongside and equip that person to function within the mission field that God has placed them in, and they actually go get paid to be a missionary. The church is people. It's not the building. It's not our church services. And yet we do so much about our church and our building, and I don't want to lose that. I love that aspect, but what about validating and come alongside people and empowering them, releasing them? And we applaud things. We applaud, the person who devoted so much time at the church and did this and did that. But what about the person who's going to their job faithfully every day? They're pouring themselves into people, making a difference. I'm telling you right now, in our, and I'm using the word Christian in a broad sense, in America right now, there is a void. No one is speaking into the people that are Christians at the workplace. No one's validating them. And so we end up with these separated lives that is not realistic. You don't just flip a switch and now I am a Christian, now I'm at church, and now, I'm at my work. It doesn't work that way. So the practical aspects, what are you doing to help people discover their gifts? What about young people that are growing up? What the placement? What is God calling them to do? Can you come alongside someone who says, I want to be a CPA, and help them understand, you can be a CPA and God work through you and use you on your job, and also be able to bless the local assembly or maybe other churches. What are you doing to involve people in the ministry? What about just simple things like ministry covenants? Do people even know what the expectations are? It's surprising to how many leaders I talk to and they don't have ministry covenants, or what we call job descriptions, responsibilities. The person is trying to do something but they don't know, and then the leader is frustrated because the person's not doing what they're supposed to be doing, what they're expecting, and that person's frustrated because they don't really know what it is that they're supposed to be doing. They don't know if they're empowered to do certain things, and just simple ministry covenants. Evaluations. A lot of people take evaluations, think of it as a job evaluation, but what about just sitting down with someone and the evaluation being, what is God calling you to do? What do you feel led to do? Where is God leading you right now? How can I help you? What about that type of evaluation? I remember years ago when I went on staff full-time, and it was a great leader, looked at me and said, what is your vision for the family ministries? And I was family pastor. And I said, well, what is your vision? I want to fulfill your vision. And they looked at me and they said, well, I want to know what your vision is. And we're kind of going back and forth. And I'm like, well, what is your vision? And then they said something profound to me. They said, my vision was to launch a family ministries and bring you here to help lead it. That's my vision. So now I want to know, what is your vision for leading the family ministries? And I said, I have one. And I began to talk about it. And he looked at me and he said, that's excellent. What do you need me to do to make things move forward? Not one time, 9 years, never one time did he come to me and say, this is what I want you to do, boom, boom, boom. That's delegation. Instead, he empowered me and said, I want you to lead this. What do you see and what can I do to help you? He would talk to me about things, help me see things and parameters and mindsets. One of the greatest things that he ever did was that he said, I want you to write down all the people that you influence. And I want you to write down, do you influence them because of a friend? Do you influence them because of being a pastor in their life? What level of influence? And then I want you to notice, is that person new in the last 3 or 4 years, or has that person been here for a long time? And as I begin to do that exercise, it began to dawn on me the people that I had surrounded myself with were people that had been new to the church in the last 3 years. And so the big majority of the families, about 150 that I was leading at the time, had been there, at least over half of them had been there longer than 3 to 4 or 5 years. And I realized that I needed to find someone else who had already the proven track record and the influence. And I found that person. I said, I need you on my team. And we ended up becoming a great team and was able to do some great things. So, what are you doing when these practical things? What are you doing to help people move forward? So, if you want to be a leader of growth, here's a few things you need to consider. One, examine your philosophies. Your philosophies, and let me explain this. And Brother D.G. Hargrove, if you ever heard him talk about this, it's so excellent. So some of this I've picked up from him and things that I've read and put together. But your philosophies actually are what determine your values. Your values is what produces your behaviors, and your behaviors will determine your destination. So I usually say it like this: if I can be around you long enough, I can tell you what your future is going to look like, and I can tell you because I can watch your behaviors. I watch your behaviors enough, I'll know where you're headed. What's interesting, though, is that your behaviors are produced by what your values are. Your values come from your philosophies. So a few years ago, was at a church quite a few times. They brought me in to speak to the leaders, and I was there enough to observe their behaviors. So I knew, based on their behaviors, what their value was. But I asked them in about 18 of the leaders, I said, I want to ask you a question. If you ran into somebody at Walmart and they said, I really love your church, would you respond, A, oh, when did you see our building? B, when were you in our church service? Or C, who did you meet from our church? Well, I knew the answer. The answer was B. When were you in our church service? Went around the room, all 18, when were you in our church service? And I said, this is a great value. You value having a great church service, a great move of God. I applaud that. I value that. I said, but interesting. I said, is that and I walk into your foyer and I see the signs. I walk into your auditorium, I see the signs. Everywhere that I look, it says, whole families made whole. I say, you say that you value families. I said, you don't. And they were kind of like shocked. I said, I can prove it. And I looked at the administrative pastor there, was also the worship pastor. I said, I can prove it. I said, you start practice at X time. This is the time that you start on Sunday, but you're here 20 minutes late. You live 2 miles away. You're single. I said, there are people on your team that have a family with children that are driving 15, 20 minutes away, and they're here on time. You don't value families. You value a great move of God. I said, I can still prove it. I take another step. I said, you run practice up until right the time the church starts. I said, then you run off and you have a holy huddle. He said, a holy huddle? I'm like, yeah, you go have your quick little prayer meeting. I said, and then you walk back in and somebody walks up to the pulpit and puts on their preacher voice and says, bless God, let's all stand. We're going to have an incredible move of the Lord here today. Let's lift our hands and our voices. And I said, it's not relating. And I said, here's the crazy thing. You're starting church 15 minutes late. I said, so what's happening is that you've got guests that are walking in thinking church starts at 10 o'clock, only to find out it's actually starting 15 minutes later. The church has become accustomed to you starting late. They're not getting there until almost 15 minutes later. Your people on your platform are practicing. They're not connecting with the people. And I said, and then they're walking up to the pulpit ready to have this great big church service. I said, there's no connection with the end of this. So I said, this is why you are running your practices late. This is why you're doing this, because you value having a great church service. You want the performance. So nothing wrong with that. I said, but you're saying that you value families. I said, you don't value families. I said, I can take it a step further. And I started talking about their calendar and how involved everyone was. And I said, you don't even take time to spend with your families for families to have family time. I said, you're so busy trying to be a big, big church with all kinds of activity, and you're killing the people that you're working with. So, values is not just something that you say. It's not about just creating a value statement. Your values are exactly what is producing your behavior. So if you don't like where you're at right now, you don't like where you're headed, you take inventory of it and you realize, man, something's got to change. Well, you got to look at your values. You got to look at it. And then if you find out those values are not what they need to be, look at your philosophy, because your philosophy is producing that value. What is my mindset? So I don't have time to go real deep into that, but let me move on and make the second point is that saying no to good things is very important. It's every bit as important as saying yes. So if I figure out, okay, this is where I want to go, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to become, this is what I need to be focusing on, then in order to do that, I have to say no to good things. Apple did one thing really good, and that is they expend an enormous amount of energy focusing on just a few things. Just a few. Research actually shows that if you will focus on 2 to 4 things, you are likely to accomplish 1 to 2 of those. If you focus on 4 to 10 things, you will accomplish 1. If you focus on 10 or more things, you will accomplish 0. This is the reason so many of us see where we need to go, but we're involved in so many things, focusing on so many things, and we set a goal at the beginning of the year, and at the end of the year, we're like trying to set the goal again and set it again, and we never really gain traction where we need to be going with things because we are caught in the whirlwind of life, and there's so many things going on, and we're spinning, and we got to get this going, that going, that going, and we're like, well, I got to focus on this, that, and this, and we actually accomplish very little. And if we would just focus on 2 to 4 things, we will accomplish those, at least 1 to 2 of those things. So once you do that, you've got to figure out how to maintain your focus. How do I do this? How do I maintain my focus? So focus is not, now, even though we've got to say no, we can't say no to everything. So focus is not completely found in eliminating all distractions, but it's found in aligning myself with purpose. So I may have distractions around me, things going on, things I still got to take care of, but how can I align with my purpose and stay aligned with that? So I want to show you something very practical, very, very practical, and hopefully this will be of help to you. And someone help me out. What time do I need to be? At 10:20, I need to be done? Okay, good luck with that one because it's 10:23 right now. We go 10:30, and then we need to break into our groups. Okay, so here it is real quick. 4 things you need to do. 1, do. 2, defer. 3, delete. Or 4, delegate. Your mind, and this is what I met with a consultant, I felt like I was a little 5-year-old in my bedroom, and my mom said, you cannot go outside and play until you clean your room, and I didn't know where to start. I feel like a lot of times we're like that in life. There's so many things. What do I do? How do I get going? Met with a consultant, travels all over America, sits down, he goes, where are you at with things right now? I said, man, and I told him what I just shared. He goes, I'm getting ready to help you. He said, I typically could charge somewhere around $4,500 to do this. And I'm like, man, I don't have that kind of money. He said, I'm going to do it for free. He said, I just feel led to pour into you. He said, your mind should be like calm water. It works best. It's a tool. It's a tool, and it works best when it's calm like water. He said if you throw a pebble in, it causes a ripple. It reaches the banks, it dissipates. Throw in several pebbles, it causes more ripples. They crash into one another. He said what happens in life sometimes is that a pebble gets thrown into our water that's already got a lot of pebbles in it, and all of a sudden it causes a tsunami. And now something that should have been little is causing us to yell at our spouse, and it's causing us to get mad, and we're yelling at the guy driving next to us, and normally we shouldn't be yelling at the person, but we just got too many pebbles going on in our life. And so he said, you've got to eliminate all of that. So he said, this is what you got to do, and I'm going to try to make this fast. So stay with me, okay? You got to make a list, all the things you said you were going to do. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, everything. I made my list, came back with about 30 things. He said, no, that's not it. I mean everything you said you was going to do. I ended up with like 110, 120. He said, that's good. He said, we're going to take that list and we're going to go through and we're going to determine, do you really want to do that, or do you want to delete it? Or would you like to defer it to a later date, or do you want to delegate it? So I went through my list. He said, so you want to learn Adobe Illustrator? I'm like, man, I really need to. He goes, are you serious? You have a doctorate, you're trying to write books, you're trying to do this, you're trying to do that. You want to go learn Adobe Illustrator? Do you realize you can pay somebody $5 on Fiverr to do that for you? And I'm like, I don't want to learn Adobe Illustrator. I'll pay $5. So I took that one off my list, although I had spent several $100s buying Adobe Illustrator. Took it off my list. He said, if you made an agreement with someone else that you were going to do it and you decide to delete it, you got to go tell that person, because your mind will remind you every time that, oh, you got to do this even though you haven't done anything. So I said, well, I'll do that. I left one thing on my list. My dad, sitting over here.
I'll be happy to address them. Yes, Brother Stark.
Sent me a manuscript for a book that he wanted me to edit several years ago, and I said, yeah, I'll edit that book. I haven't had the heart to go back and say, I'm probably not going to edit that book. So I have not deleted that from my list. So every time I sit down to...
You know, I have here in my notes, I use the same principle that Global Missions does. I look for self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating. And
right, which is almost every day. One of the thoughts that will come to my mind is, oh, you need to edit your dad's book. You need to edit your dad's book. You need to edit your dad's manuscript. And because I haven't deleted it, so it adds another thing in my mind. So you have to tell the person I'm...
As a year, that's very unusual. And I've done it where it was 10 years or more, because it really just depends on the situation. But I look for self-governing. So you have to have some lay leadership. And typically, now here's what I did. When we made a church self-governing, I set up a church board with 3 board members. The pastor, I as the senior pastor, and 1 lay leader. So they have
to do this. If you're going to defer it to a later date, it's the same principle. You've got to put it on the calendar. I'm going to look at this 6 months from now, then I might consider it. If you're going to delegate it, same principle. I delegate it to you, and now my mind's going to remind me, is he doing this job? But instead, I got to put it in my calendar and say in 5 months or 5 weeks, I'll check and see, or 5 days, I'll check and see if he's got it done. So now my mind is released from that. He took me through this process.
I had to have at least 1 mature lay leader other than the pastor. And the reason I did it this way, it was only temporary, but if you notice that structure, the local church was in control of its own governance because it had 2 out of 3. But the 2 ministers were in control of the governance because they were 2 out of 3. So if some unforeseen problem happened once that church got on its own, I am the now former Daughterworks, now pastor, could effectively head off any problems. So when that pastor would tell me maybe a year or two later, well, Brother Bernard, I think I got someone else that I can put in your place, I would happily step aside. It wasn't about retaining control. It was about protection of that pastor. So you need, in addition to a board member, you need some that like Sunday school teachers, whatever. So you look for leadership within the local church. You don't want the mother church supplying all the leaders. They're not ready to be.
And for 15 hours, about a couple of weeks later, I'm driving across America, 15-hour trip by myself. And normally when I ride down the road and I get away, my mind starts remembering things, and I'll start making notes of things I forgot to do. And, oh, I need to do that. I got to check with this person. For 15 hours driving down the road, I couldn't think of one thing. Nothing. Because I had a list. I had a plan. I had either delegated it, deferred it, I had deleted it, or I was going to do it. And if I was going to do it, I knew my plan. My plan in doing it was that I had to create my desired result. I'm going to do this. What does my desired result look like? The second one is, what is my next step? This is my biggest issue. I have a vision. I can see vision easy. Very easy for me to see.
Self-governing. Second thing is self-supporting. So I expected that they were able to pay, if they're paying rent or whatever, that they were covering their own expenses. They weren't being subsidized. And then the third thing, self-propagating. They're growing through their own outreach. So initially, the mother church might be supplying Bible study teachers, and all the growth might be generated by the activities of mother church people on loan to them or helping them. Well, they're not ready. But once they have those three
vision, my problem is that when I go take my next step, I want to make a giant leap. So I create my next step. My next step's way on down the road, and I don't move forward because I haven't really clearly defined what that next step is. And this is a huge challenge for me. I'm always going back. The next step should be something you could actually do in 15, 20 minutes. It's who's the phone call that I need to make in order to move forward on this project? Who's the person that I need to email? Who do I need to talk to? Whatever it is, that next step. And then the third one is, and pretty big one, is that you've got to take the things you're going to do. Your
criteria, then they would be ready to go on their own. Usually, I would say a realistic thing might be 3 to 5 years. But in certain circumstances, it could be accelerated.
And you got to create that next step, and you got to put it into your calendar. You got to live by blocks of time on your calendar. So I did this, and when we got done, I had a list of about 40 things I was going to do. Those 40 things, put them into projects, and I ended up with I think it was 10 different projects at the time. And this is pretty standard. He does this with CEOs all over America. I did this on a Word document. I've got all kinds of programs, and I just got tired of messing with programs, and I did a Word document. Now I use Evernote. And so I created these projects, and on each one of those projects, desired result, and then what is my next step? And it's just so simple. So you take that. I met with some guys who were coming together to form a new company, and they had worked for Northrop Grumman, which is like 80, 100,000 plus employees for the Defense Department. Guys, high level, they bring in the consultants, pay them $25,000, $30,000 a week. I met with those guys and took them through the same process. I said, what do you guys really want to do? They had a list of 150 things. Broke it down into like 11 different categories. Out of those 11 categories, what is the desired result? What is the next step? And they begin to move forward in this process. Amazing, we do this in Katy. I've taken churches through this process. What are all the things that you want to do and that you're trying to do? And so they had like evangelism, they had the building and maintenance and this and that, and they created these projects. And then, okay, what is the desired result? What is the next step? And what ends up happening in that, and I'm going to close with this, what ends up happening with that is that we know that there are things that we need to be doing that we're not really doing. It goes back to Stephen Covey, the 4 quadrants. The things that are really important but they're not urgent are the things that we put off until they become urgent, then it's a crisis. We don't need to be doing that. We need to be diligent with this. So if we do this right, we can free ourselves up to really focus on those 2 to 3, 4 things that we know we really need to be doing. Does this make sense? Now, I've thrown a lot at you really, really fast, and I apologize for that, trying to make up some time here. My friend, he met with a guy who said he was going to, his goal was to lose weight. He had to lose X amount of weight. Doctors told him he needed to lose weight, and he said he came back. Every time he met with him, every week, the guy was never making any progress in losing weight. He said, "Do you really want to lose weight?" And the guy said, "Man," he goes, "I love to eat." He said, "Well, just tell your doctor and your wife that you're going to die a couple of years early, but you're going to take it off your list." He said, "I can do that?" He goes, "Most certainly." So he took it off his list. He came back the next week. He said, "I went and told my doctor. I went and told my wife." He said, "I feel so free." Met with another CEO, and the guy said, "I need to write a book, write a book, write a book." All my employees, my team, everybody keeps saying, "Write a book." And the family, he was not making any progress. He says, "Do you really want to write a book?" And the guy says, "No, I hate writing." He said, "Take it off your list." He said, "I can do that?" He goes, "Yes, you can do that. Take it off your list." So some of the things that we say we want to do, we really need to sit down and take the time, go through this. You should be somewhere around 100 things that you're going to do. Take it with your team in the church. Get together. You should be around 100 things. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, and then determine what really do we want to do. Can we delete this? Can we defer this? Can we delegate this to someone else? If we're going to do it, what is the desired result? What is the next step? And make sure that next step is something simple that you can move forward in. And then one last thing I didn't throw in there is to track that next step, because over a period of time you will become frustrated because you won't think that you're moving forward. The truth is you will be making huge strides, and just look at it. So some questions, and you can do a Q&A or break into your small groups. Questions you may want to consider. Do you know what it is that you really need to do right now? What is it that you need to be focusing on? And what are the steps that you need to take to get there? So if you would like, I don't know, if you want to get with your team, maybe step out in the hallway, talk for a minute. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer any questions. So first of all, any questions real quick?
I have one. When will you get back to my book?
Okay. When will I get back to this book? Oh, my. I'll have to talk about that. Defer that one. I'm going to defer that one. Okay, let's meet in your small groups, and if you're here with your church, your team, get together. If you're not, maybe you can get together with a couple people near you and talk about this for a moment. I'll walk around. If you have any questions for me, I'll do my best to answer them. But talk about it. What is it that I actually need to do? What is it that God's leading me to do? What do I need to be focusing on right now? And what are the steps I need to take to get there? And break that down. I'll come around and talk with you, and if you have any questions.
In other circumstances, and for instance, the one that we did just after a year or so, it was a town 2 hours away. The pastor had been a resident for many years, but he felt called to preach. He started the church. So he already had the networks. He had people in the community that were donating. And it was 2 hours away. It was really too far for our people to help him. So after a year, he was ready to go on his own. On the other hand, we had another daughter work in a very depressed area. We were able to get a very good building at a low price, but we never could get a resident pastor who could get a job in that community. So, for years, and still, I think it's still a daughter work, because we can't get resident ministry, and so we have people who commute and keep the church alive. So, sure.
I don't mean to take us out of the scope of what you're saying, but sometimes we have churches in our districts, I'll just keep it nameless, where we have lost churches for various reasons.
Yes.
We're doing Daughterworks for good reasons, and the net effect numerically is just that. It's no increase in the number of churches. So I guess I'm cross further than is there some cases where an established church reverts back to a Daughterworks?
Yes.
When it comes to the rescue?
Yes. Now, this is what we did, and this is one of the beauties of the daughter work concept. With the 16 I've told you about, and others beyond that, there have been times where there was a pastoral transition. If that daughter work had been autonomous, it probably would have closed down. But because, and there are many reasons for pastoral transition. One could be health, it could be family circumstances, a job. And so most of the time when it's a daughter work, we can salvage that, because if that pastor has to resign and leave, we can just keep sending people from the mother church, or even have a temporary person from the mother church until such time as we identify a pastor, whether from locally or even from outside. So, and then there were times we did this with Daughterworks even after they became self-governing. And I always told the district, and Pastor Shaw, who's the pastor now, he always works with the district. Once it's a self-governing church, then of course the district steps in. But the district is very happy to get help. So if it's one of our former Daughterworks, even though they're self-governing, they're going to contact Brother Shaw and say, hey, can you help us out here? Can you cover it until we get someone? Or do you have someone in mind? Do you know someone who's interested? And so that relationship still exists. And then further, I would say, sometimes there are small churches that never were Daughterworks, but they're struggling. The pastor retires, the pastor dies, and maybe the way to keep that church open is to turn it into a Daughterwork. So I would say, now that could be done by the congregation itself voting, asking the district, we need help. And usually what happens is they try to get a pastor, they can't. And so maybe the district would say, hey, there's a neighboring church here who would be glad to help you out if you will agree to become a Daughterwork, and then the district board approve it. And sometimes there's maybe a building and no faithful people left. The district just steps in and recruits a neighboring pastor to take it over. So that, to me, is a way to salvage a lot of churches that otherwise would close down. Yes. Yes.
Question about working in rural areas. So some of the highly populated areas seem to have more churches. People are coming into those, but we still have a lot of churches that are in rural areas. Can you make an application to rural areas?
Yes. Well, I think the Daughterwork concept works great, because let's say you have a town of 10,000 people and no church. It's going to be very hard to recruit somebody to move there, relocate their family, get a job. But if it's within a driving distance of a strong church, and that strong church has young ministers who are eager to preach, and maybe they're trying to qualify for ministerial license, well, you could start, and if you start with an outreach and just let it grow to the next level based on the demand. Again, I'm kind of using a market terminology. So if it's just a Bible study and they're just a handful, you just keep it that way. But if it grows, the demand requires it, you make it a preaching point. You go to the next level. You make it a Daughterwork. But you could still operate from the mother church, and even though you would like to see it self-governing, you could go for years like that with young ministers from your church. And what I would do in some of those cases, I would appoint even a senior minister or a retired minister to kind of be the overseer or the coordinator. So that gave some stability and some wisdom. But then we could use different young ministers to fill the slots. So it's good to have one contact person or one overseer. But that could be a way to raise up a church until it's strong enough that somebody could move there and be at least partially supported by that group. So I think it works well in a rural setting or a small town setting, as long as you have a mother church within whatever radius you think is reasonable, but say a 50-mile radius where the ministers can commute. And usually smaller churches are more flexible. You could have a service that is compatible with the mother church's schedule. So we would do anywhere from Saturday night, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, or Sunday night. And so they could operate a church schedule, and even the senior pastor could go there from time to time. And he could actually be the pastor of both churches if that's what was needed. And I see that as a way to start in a small community. Yeah. Yes.
How long before your initial church plant began to have Daughterworks? So you went to Austin.
Yeah, it was 7 years. We started, as I told you, our first effort was Spanish speaking, and it failed. I had an internal person, but he didn't really have the capability, so that failed. Then I recruited an external person, and he proved to be unreliable. That didn't work. But after 7 years, we were finally able to raise up a Spanish-speaking minister who could sustain it. But then after that first one, we started doing 1 or 2 a year because our church was growing. And I will say this. You do, like if you think of 16 Daughterworks, just take those pastors and their families, multiply that. That's a significant number of people and tithing. If you consider that maybe an average of one other family as their assistant or as helper, well, that's quite a few. And then if you consider there are going to be some unintentional transfers, that once that's going, there's somebody that lives nearby, no matter what you say, they're going to want to go there, and you don't want to crack the whip. So for 16, you could easily have 3 or 4 families for each one that you lose. So that is a worry and a fear, and that's legitimate. But here's what I would say. The mother church continued to grow more than that. I don't think the mother church would have grown that much had there not been that flow. Like for today, the mother church would have approximately 1,000. All those other churches put together would have approximately 1,000. I do not think if we didn't start any daughter work, we'd have 2,000 people. There's no way. So it ended up not hurting the mother church because the mother church continued to grow. And I think the training, the involvement, the outreach actually helped the mother church to grow. For instance, a large church may have a number of people who are capable musicians. Maybe some older people who play the piano, but they don't play the latest style. Well, a daughter work of 20 people would be glad to have that person play the piano. So you can multiply musicians and other workers who never intend to leave the mother church, but they go once a week to this other location and feel very rewarded. They're in turn more committed to the mother church because they are involved. And younger people like that get trained. I had all of my kids help out in Daughterworks at different times. They were trained in ministry in a small church setting that they would not have had at where the place at our church had arrived. So if it's done right, I think you can calibrate it so that it doesn't hurt the growth of the mother church. And I would argue even enhances, keeps the revival spirit so that the mother church is actually growing more than if you didn't have it. Because no matter how great the church is, it's hard to sustain a revival thrust every year, every season, all the time. But with the daughter work concepts, you can do that. Yeah.
If the initial church plant started with like a solid church planting team,
Yes.
could you see starting Daughterworks sooner than 7 years?
Yes.
I think that if you had, like, so if the mother started with 5 strong apostolic families, and some of them were already like
Yeah.
this, could you perceive perhaps having Daughterworks sooner?
Yeah, I think it's all based on individual. Here's the thing. A daughter work, the way I've described it, doesn't have to start with a heavy investment of cash. Our first daughter works had very small outlays of cash because we're basically depending on someone who's in the church who's got a full-time job, and we're either, sometimes they get a free facility or very small with like another church's facilities, a school, storefront, even a home. So it would be very minimal cost, and if there was a cost, the mother church could perhaps guarantee it. But one of the first things you do as you start getting people is say, well, we're going to take up an offering just to cover the rent, utilities. So most people can understand that. And so even if they're not really committed to the church, they'll give a little in the offering. So what we found under that model, this outreach model, you could actually plant a daughter work with a very little initial investment. And what I try to tell the pastor is, look, let's grow it like this, and as tithing comes in, let's just set it aside in the fund, And if you need to be part-time or full-time, we can consider a housing allowance, but let's also consider a building fund. And so I talked to them, and most of them would say, hey, I'll keep my job or my wife or whatever. Let's just put this money aside for a building. And then I would say, look, when you really get ready to buy land or a building or make some major change, we'll go to the mother church and ask for an offering. And they all know you. They all see what's going on. And I even had businessmen in the church that caught the vision, and they would give, major offerings specifically for a building program. Now, later, when we got more intentional, the first Daughterworks were just opportunistic. An existing contact or someone who was called to ministry that lived in an area, and we just exploited that at minimal cost. But later, we started being very strategic. Okay, what areas of town are not being served? What suburbs are not being... and so what we did there is then we did establish a budget and recruited a minister to come in and would say, okay, we're going to give you $1,000 a month for 12 months. And after 12 months, we're going to reevaluate it. That requires a little bit more significant investment. So I would say the church has to be a little stronger to do those kind of plans. Okay, all right. Let's take the break.